For 35 years, the murder of Roxanne Wood haunted the quiet town of Niles, Michigan. A brutal crime with no answers, a family left in agony, and a community living with fear. But in 2022, a stunning breakthrough finally revealed the truth. This is the story of a cold case that refused to die. Roxanne Wood was 30 years old in 1987. She was vibrant, full of life, and deeply loved by those around her. Friends described her as someone who could make anyone feel welcome. She had a laugh that carried across a room, a smile that lit up conversations, and a warmth that made her unforgettable. She lived with her husband, Terry, in a modest home in Niles. Their life was ordinary in the best way. Dinners together, evenings spent with friends, plans for the future. Roxanne worked hard, cared deeply for her family, and had dreams of building a life filled with love and stability. Terry adored her. Their marriage was not perfect, no marriage is, but it was strong. They shared routines, inside jokes, and the kind of quiet companionship that comes from truly knowing someone. On the night of February 20th, 1987, Terry went out to a local bowling alley with friends. It was a normal evening, nothing unusual. Roxanne stayed home. She may have planned to relax, perhaps watch television, perhaps prepare for the weekend. When Terry returned home later that night, he walked into a nightmare. Inside their home, Roxanne had been brutally murdered. The violence of the attack was shocking. Terry's world collapsed in an instant. The crime scene was chaotic, but investigators struggled to find clear evidence. They collected DNA samples, but in 1987, forensic science was still in its infancy. DNA testing was not yet the powerful tool it is today. Detectives interviewed neighbors, friends, and potential suspects, but the case quickly went cold. For years, the murder of Roxanne Wood became one of Michigan's most haunting mysteries. Terry lived under suspicion for a time, something that often happens in cases where a spouse discovers the victim, but no evidence ever tied him to the crime. The community was left with fear. Who could have committed such a brutal act? Was it a stranger? Someone they knew? To understand the weight of this case, you have to picture Niles, Michigan, in the late 1980s. It was a town of just over 12,000 people. Nestled in the southwest corner of the state near the Indiana border, Niles was the kind of place where people greeted each other by name at the grocery store, where the local bowling alley doubled as a social hub, and where crime was something people believed happened in big cities, not in their own backyard. The economy was modest but stable. Families worked in manufacturing, education, and small businesses. Summers were filled with community festivals, parades, and baseball games. Winters were quiet, with snow blanketing the streets and children sledding down neighborhood hills. In this environment, Roxanne and Terry Wood built their life. Their home was modest but comfortable, a place filled with laughter and warmth. Roxanne was known for her kindness. Friends described her as someone who always remembered birthdays, who brought food to neighbors in need, and who had a way of making people feel valued. Terry was equally well-liked. He was social, often spending evenings at the bowling alley with friends. He and Roxanne had a rhythm to their life. Dinners together, weekends with family, plans for vacations. They were not wealthy, but they were happy. On the night of February 20th, 1987, Terry went out to bowl with friends. It was a normal Friday night, nothing unusual. Roxanne stayed home. Perhaps she planned to relax. Perhaps she had chores to finish. Perhaps she simply wanted a quiet evening. When Terry returned home later that night, he walked into a nightmare. Inside their home, Roxanne had been brutally murdered. The violence of the attack was shocking. She had been stabbed, and the scene was chaotic. Terry's world collapsed in an instant. The first moments after his discovery were filled with panic. He called for help, his voice shaking, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Police arrived quickly, but what they found was a crime scene that offered few clear answers. Investigators collected DNA samples, fingerprints, and other evidence. But in 1987, forensic science was still in its infancy. DNA testing was not yet the powerful tool. It is today. The samples were preserved, but they could not be analyzed in a way that would identify the killer. Detectives interviewed neighbors, friends, and potential suspects. They looked at Terry closely, as is common in cases where a spouse discovers the victim. For a time, suspicion hung over him, but no evidence ever tied him to the crime. The investigation stalled. Leads dried up. Rumors spread through the community. Some believed it was a random act of violence. Others whispered that Roxanne had been targeted. For years, the murder of Roxanne Wood became one of Michigan's most haunting mysteries. The case was discussed in hushed tones, remembered in local newspapers, and passed down as a warning parents told their children to lock their doors. Neighbors looked at each other with suspicion. The community was left with fear. Who could have committed such a brutal act? Was it a stranger passing through town? Someone they knew? When detectives first arrived at the Wood home in February 1987, they were confronted with a crime scene that was both chaotic and frustratingly sparse. In usable evidence, Roxanne's murder was brutal, but the killer had left behind little that investigators could immediately act upon. They collected DNA samples, fingerprints, and fibers, but the technology of the time was simply not advanced enough to make sense of it. In the late 1980s, DNA testing was still experimental. The FBI had only begun using it in select cases, and local police departments often lacked the resources or expertise. For the Niles Police Department, the evidence collected from Roxanne's home was carefully preserved, but it was essentially useless for identifying a suspect. Detectives interviewed neighbors, friends, and family. Terry Wood, Roxanne's husband, was naturally scrutinized. In many homicide cases, investigators begin with the spouse or partner. Terry's discovery of the body placed him at the center of suspicion. For months, whispers circulated in town. Was Terry hiding something? Could he have been involved? But the evidence didn't support those suspicions. Terry cooperated fully, passed polygraph tests, and no physical evidence tied him to the crime. Eventually, investigators had to look elsewhere. Theories emerged. Some believed Roxanne had been targeted by a stranger passing through town. Others suspected someone she knew. But with no clear leads, the case began to stall. As the years passed, the case grew colder. In the 1990s, detectives revisited the evidence with new eyes, hoping that advances in forensic science might provide answers. DNA testing was becoming more reliable, but the samples from Roxanne's case were not sufficient to generate a clear profile. Rumors continued to swirl in Niles. Some residents believed the killer was someone local, someone who had blended back into the community. Others thought it was a transient, someone who had committed the crime and then disappeared. Detectives chased leads that went nowhere. Suspects were questioned, alibis checked, but nothing stuck. Each time the case was revisited, hope would rise briefly, only to fade again. For Terry, the 1990s were a decade of quiet suffering. He lived under the shadow of suspicion, even though he had been cleared. Friends supported him, but whispers persisted. The grief of losing Roxanne was compounded by the lack of closure. By the early 2000s, DNA technology had advanced significantly. Cold case units across the country were solving crimes that had been dormant for decades. Detectives in Niles hoped Roxanne's case might finally yield answers. The preserved DNA evidence was re-examined. This time, scientists were able to generate a partial profile. It wasn't enough to identify a suspect outright, but it was progress. The profile was entered into CODIS, the National DNA Database. Years passed, but no match was found. The killer's DNA did not appear in the system. This suggested that the perpetrator had never been arrested for a crime that required DNA collection. Still, the case remained active. Detectives refused to let it die. They revisited old suspects, re-interviewed witnesses, and tried to piece together new theories. But again, the trail went cold. In the 2010s, a new tool emerged that would revolutionize cold case investigations: genetic genealogy. This technique used public genealogy databases, like GED Match, to identify suspects through family connections. The breakthrough came in 2018 with the arrest of Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer. Investigators had used genetic genealogy to trace his DNA to relatives, eventually identifying him as the killer. The case made headlines worldwide and opened the door for similar techniques to be used in other cold cases. Detectives in Niles took notice. They knew Roxanne's case had preserved DNA evidence. They knew traditional methods had failed. Genetic genealogy offered a new path. In 2022, investigators submitted Roxanne's DNA evidence for genetic genealogy analysis. The process was painstaking. Scientists compared the DNA to profiles in public databases, looking for relatives. Slowly, a family tree began to emerge. At the center of that tree was a man named Samuel McAuliffe. He had a history of violent crime, though he had never been convicted of murder. His DNA matched the evidence from Roxanne's case. When confronted, McAuliffe confessed. After 35 years, the mystery was finally solved. The decades between Roxanne's murder and McAuliffe's arrest were filled with frustration, false leads, and lingering suspicion. Detectives refused to give up, even when the trail seemed hopeless. Terry lived under the weight of grief and suspicion, never knowing if the case would be solved. The breakthrough in 2022 was not just a victory for science. It was a testament to persistence. It showed that cold cases are never truly forgotten, that justice can be delayed, but not denied. By 2022, the decades of frustration surrounding Roxanne Wood's murder had hardened into a kind of grim acceptance. For many in Niles, the case had become a ghost story, a reminder of vulnerability, a tale parents told their children about why doors should be locked at night. For Terry Wood, however, it was not folklore. It was a wound that never healed. When investigators finally identified Samuel McAuliffe through genetic genealogy, the revelation was both shocking and strangely anticlimactic. McAuliffe was not a household name in Niles. He was not a prominent suspect who had been whispered about for years. He was, in many ways, a shadow figure, someone who had drifted through life with a history of violence, but had managed to avoid the kind of scrutiny that would have tied him to Roxanne's murder. McAuliffe's background revealed a man with a troubling past. He had been involved in assaults, petty crimes, and had a reputation for volatility. Yet, he had never been convicted of murder. His DNA, preserved at the crime scene for decades, was the silent witness that finally betrayed him. When confronted with the evidence, McAuliffe confessed. The confession was not dramatic. It was not filled with remorse or theatrics. It was instead a quiet acknowledgement of guilt, the kind of admission that comes when the weight of evidence is undeniable. For Terry, the confession was both liberating and devastating. Liberating because it cleared him once and for all of suspicion. Devastating because it reopened the wound of Roxanne's death. Closure is a complicated word in cases like this. Justice had been served, but the loss remained. The courtroom scenes were somber. McAuliffe faced the consequences of his crime, but the trial was not about spectacle. It was about resolution. For Roxanne's family, it was the end of a nightmare. For the community, it was proof that persistence and science could triumph over time. The arrest and confession of McAuliffe were covered in local and national media. Headlines spoke of the 35-year mystery solved, of DNA breakthrough, of justice delayed but not denied. For many, it was a reminder that cold cases are never truly forgotten. For the people of Niles, the resolution of Roxanne's case was more than just the closing of a file. It was the lifting of a shadow that had hung over the town for decades. Generations had grown up hearing about Roxanne's murder. Children who were born after 1987 knew the story. Parents used it as a cautionary tale. Neighbors whispered theories. The case became part of the town's identity. When the case was finally solved, the impact was profound. Vigils were held. Community members gathered to reflect on the decades of fear and uncertainty. For many, it was the first time they could speak openly about the case without the weight of suspicion or speculation. The resolution also brought healing. For Terry, it meant the end of whispers. For Roxanne's family, it meant answers. For the community, it meant closure. But the case also raised questions. How had McAuliffe evaded justice for so long? Could the case have been solved earlier if technology had advanced faster? What does it mean for other cold cases still waiting for resolution? The impact extended beyond Niles. Across the country, the case was cited as an example of the power of genetic genealogy. It became part of a larger conversation about the role of science in solving crimes, about the balance between privacy and justice, and about the importance of preserving evidence. For Niles, however, the case was personal. It was about a woman who had been loved, a family that had suffered, and a community that had lived in fear. The resolution was not just about justice, it was about healing. The resolution of Roxanne Wood's murder highlights how persistence and science can overcome decades of silence. In 1987, DNA evidence was collected, but technology was too limited to identify her killer. Over the years, forensic science advanced, from partial DNA profiles in the 1990s to CODIS in the 2000s, and finally to genetic genealogy in the 2010s. This new technique, which compares crime scene DNA to public genealogy databases, ultimately led investigators to Samuel McAuliffe in 2022. His confession brought closure after 35 years. The case also raises important ethical questions. Should law enforcement have access to public DNA databases? Does justice outweigh privacy concerns? Roxanne's story is part of this ongoing debate, reminding us that solving crimes often requires balancing innovation with civil liberties. For Niles, Michigan, the breakthrough was deeply personal. It lifted suspicion from Roxanne's husband Terry, healed a community scarred by fear, and proved that cold cases are never truly forgotten. For decades, Roxanne's murder was a mystery, but science and determination finally brought justice. With modern technology, more families may one day find the closure they deserve.